Hello guys, Monkhouse here. Today we're going to be looking at functions. So all of the videos up to this point we've really been writing what a lot of people call spaghetti code. There's no real structure, there's no real thought about having to maintain the code. It's only been a small amount of code, in all fairness, in each video, but there's been no real structure to it at all. It's just been kind of writing what we want when we want it. So in reality what we want to do is to make our code more modular. So over this video and the next few videos we're going to be looking at functions and classes and structures and basically looking at ways that we can make our code neater. So let's get started. So I talked about modularization just now, which is what we're trying to achieve. So if I start writing some code now, what we could do, for example, is we're going to use the define keyword, and when we use the define keyword we're saying we're making a function. So we could do something like multiply, like this, and this is a function now, and what we're going to do is we're going to give it two parameters. So that's what we call this, and they're just going to be x and y, like this. So now we've got a function called multiply, and it's got one parameter x and one parameter y, and then what we want to do is we're going to print the result of x times y. Now x and y doesn't exist yet, but we will define it when we call the function. On top of this, what we usually do is we basically put return, if we're not returning the value, so what we might want to do is we might also want to return the value or just return a 1, which I'll explain more about in a bit, but we'll leave that blank for the moment and we'll explain that towards the end of the video. So calling this function now, all we have to do is something like this. We do multiply, and then we pass it parameter 1 and parameter 2, and what this is going to do is it's going to say, well, we're going to do x, which is 5, and y, which is 6. So these are literal placeholders, and we would get an error if we just left this blank, because we wouldn't have an x and a y. So 5 and 6, we're going to call this function now, we're going to execute it, and we're going to get our value 30. So an alternative way we can do that without having to print inside the function is to actually just return the value instead. So what we can do is we can go into our function, and what we're going to do now, instead of printing it, we're going to return x times y. And what's probably a little bit neater is to actually just say we're going to have this result, and this result is going to equal x times y. And the reason we would do that instead of just having it in the return statement is because imagine that we've got this big function that's doing quite a lot. Then you're not going to put all of that inside of the return, just on this return line. You're not going to put a whole paragraph of code. So it's better just leave your code inside here, and then at the end you're going to have some kind of result, and then we're going to return the result. So now if we executed this script, what we would get is nothing, because we're not printing anything right now. We're just returning the value. And what that essentially means is that when we call this function, it's going to return the result. And the way we access that is we could create this variable, and I'm actually going to call that result just so I can show you something else. So we're going to say result equals multiply 5, 6. So those are input parameters, and then we're going to print result. So this time we're going to get 30. But what's really important to show you is that there's this thing called, well, it's localization and this concept of local variables. And when we define a variable inside a function, that function has a scope, and that variable can only be accessed from within the function unless we purposely give something access to it. So right now this result, there's no way that we can actually access this, and the way I can show you this actually is if we just get rid of this line and we try and execute the script now, we're just going to get this error that result is not defined because it's only defined within that function. So whereas on the other hand we can have global variables outside of that scope. So if I said var equals 7 for example, and what we're going to do is we're going to go into here and we're going to print var. So at no point have we actually passed var into the function, but if we decide to call this function, what we will now see, and we're going to use 5 and 6 again, when we execute this function, we actually get 7. And that's because we've defined this variable in a global scope. So basically everything in our program is going to have access to this variable. So if you are desperate for some reason to make a variable from within a function be global or accessible to everything in your program, then you can do it. And the way you can do it is by just saying global result. And what we're saying now is that this is a global variable, so it's the same as defining it outside here. So as long as we execute this function now, so we're going to execute this function, so we're going to put in 5 and 6, what's going to happen is our result is going to be global, it's going to equal x times y, which will be 30, and then we'll return result. But if you notice, what we're going to do now, we're just going to print result, so we don't actually care about this. It still needs to execute because otherwise it won't be defined, but we're not actually using it because we're not saying a equals this, right? We're just literally printing the variable result, and what we see now when we execute it is we get our value 30. So that's how you make a variable global from within a function. This is quite dangerous, really, because obviously if you have a huge program and you have lots of functions, the chances of you eventually reusing a variable are probably quite high. So again, keep your mind focused on modularization and need to know basis. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to talk about when we would use just a return 1 and return 0, and we're actually going to build a little kind of pseudo application. You know, it doesn't really do anything, but it actually gives us an idea of how we can use a function. So what we're going to do, again, we're going to define a function, and I'm going to call it just verify user, for example. And once more, this function is going to have 2 parameters. We're going to have username, and we're going to have password. And what I'm going to say is this is going to be our verification now of our user. So we're going to say, we're going to have an if statement, and so let's just get rid of that. And what we're going to say now is if username dot lower, and what I'm doing with this is essentially we're going to get an input string, hopefully, and I'm just converting it to lowercase. So it's going to be case insensitive, and I'm going to say if this is equal to monkhouse, you can make this whatever you want. So that's kind of the first conditional, and then we're going to use the logical AND, which is going to be these double ampersand, or if you remember our logical operators, then we can just use AND. If you just use single, I think that's bitwise operations, so I don't recommend that, but you might get away with it, I'm not sure. So we can use AND, or we can use this. We're going to use that, double ampersand, and then I'm going to say password is equal to lol. So what are we saying with this statement? So we've got a function, and we're going to get 2 input parameters, so it's going to be a username and a password, and we're going to convert whatever that username is to all lowercase, and if that's equal to monkhouse, and if the password is equal to lol, then we're going to go ahead and do something. What we're going to do, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to print, and we're just going to say hello, and remember our placeholder. Then I'm going to have a comma, and we're going to say welcome back, and then in here, actually it's a method, so we're going to have .format, and we're just going to print the username, right? So if the username is correct and the password is correct, then we're going to print hello monkhouse, welcome back. And what else we're going to do is we're going to return 1. So this is telling us that that function has successfully been executed. And what we're going to do outside this if statement is we're going to say else return 0, right? And these 1s and 0s are the same as kind of saying false and true. It's just a little bit shorter, I suppose, to do 1 and 0. And then what we're going to get some inputs now from the user. So we're going to say username, and we're going to say equals input, and this is going to be a string by default. In reality, you'd probably be doing lots of validation. You'd be converting it to make sure it's a string, and then you'd be validating it. We're not going to do that, of course. and we're just going to say enter your username. It's just a command, and then we're going to have password, and again this is just going to be enter your password, and we'll do the same as before, colon and a space. And then what we can do, so we can do two things right now. We could just call the function and see what happens, in which case it would just print hello, and we'll start off with that. So we'll just say verify user, so that's our function, and then in there we're going to have uname and password. So let's go ahead and execute that. Hopefully there's no errors. So we have got an error. Maybe it doesn't like the double ampersand for some reason. So we're saying, perhaps I'll just use and. So enter your username. I'm going to say Monkhouse, and our password is lol, and it's going to say hello Monkhouse, welcome back, which I've spelled incorrectly. It says welcome back. So I'll just fix that quickly, otherwise it will irritate me. So welcome back. Now the other thing we can do is, because we're actually saying we're returning 1 and a 0, we can suddenly use this if statement, right? So we can say if verify user. So this is, remember that if we actually input the correct thing, it's going to return a 1. So we're saying if 1, if true, then do something. Otherwise it's not going to go into this. So we're saying if verify user. So if we've got our username right and our password right and it's returned 1, then this statement's going to be true. Right? This is the same as putting true here. Otherwise it's going to be false. But so we're going to print session started. We can just say you are now logged in. Now we don't have any of the information of this, but we're just going to have this statement. So let's go ahead and execute this, and we're going to enter our username as Monkhouse and our password as lol, and you see we get hello Monkhouse, welcome back, and then we also get this session started, you are now logged in. So you can play around with that and build these types of interactive applications, and functions are just really neat, you know, once you've defined them, and you need to define them at the top, and once you've done that you can just kind of move them out the way, you can move them into different files, and then all you'd be left with is the sort of API in the application, like the front layer code, and everything else will be hidden. But that's for another day. So that's functions. Hopefully that was useful.